In this video, you'll learn how to create some compositing effects to make the scene even more beautiful. So after we have set up all the render settings in the last video, we switch to the render layers tab. Rough summarized, here we can create different render layers. And then we can define that maybe on one layer just the bicycles will be rendered, on another layer just the persons and so on. And all these different render layers you can use later on in the node editor to create some effects or to adjust single elements of your render. So maybe you have your bicycles on a single layer and then you can adjust the color, the brightness and so on from just the bicycles without affecting anything else. And so you can use different render layers and in the end you put everything together to your final image again. And the basic idea of that is that you have control about anything without re-rendering your complete image, because this takes a lot of time. To create render layers you just have to click on the plus symbol and double click on the name to rename a layer, and using the layers under layer you can define what layers should be rendered on which render layer. And after you've set up all your render layers and hit render, all these render layers will be rendered in one process. For our rendering, we want to keep the compositing effects as simple as possible, but with the most beautiful result. And because of that, we'll use only one render layer. Because of that, I delete the second render layer with a minus symbol. So maybe you remember on the right lower layer we have placed all of our temporary 3D objects we needed for our particle systems, for example. But unfortunately for our final rendering we have to enable this layer, because on this layer are also the small grasses and plants which are using the animated displace modifier. And if you don't enable this layer, the animation won't show up on the particles of this grass. That means this layer has to be enabled, but we don't want to see all the objects in our final rendering. And if you take a look under layer, you find exclude. And here you can define if a layer should be rendered basically, but not in this render layer. So we enable the white lower 3D layer. Furthermore, here we have the passes. That means we can separate different passes of our rendering like color, reflection, refraction, emission, ambient occlusion, shadow and so on. That means after rendering our image we have access to all the different passes, can use them for effects or adjusting, and then in the end put them again together to a final image. So we are able to maybe adjust the shadow or to adjust the colors and so on. And the idea behind compositing is that if you have rendered your image and you notice you have to change something, you don't need to go back, change the materials for example, and re-render the image, and if you have to change anything else, re-render and re-render and re-render. And with compositing you have to render your scene once, and then you are able to have access to the different render layers and to the different passes. You can adjust everything there, and then you have your final image without re-rendering everything 1,000 times. And this basically saves a lot of render time and frustration. For our scene we will use the compositing mainly to create some nice looking effects. For that we first enable the mist pass. This is for creating some mist effects. Then we enable object index. That's for creating some mask. We can mask out different areas. That we'll use for masking out the sun rays in some areas. And then we enable environment. Basically the background will be rendered separately if we enable that, and that's very useful. Okay, about object index. If I select an object, I switch to the object tab, and then you find here under relation the pass index. In here I can define a certain number, and every object which has the same number will be rendered on a separate black and white image. And so we can define different masks according to the numbers we choose. In our case we want to create a sun rays effect. And this effect will be placed on top of our image, and that means also on top of the tree in the foreground. and we don't want that, and because of that I will give the tree and some of the other foreground objects the path index 1, and then we can use this as mask later on. So then we have enabled the mist layer. Basically that's a fog effect we can create for our scene. And if you've enabled that, we can do further adjustments in the World tab under Mist Path. And here we can define where the mist should start according to the camera position in Blender units. And with the depth value, you can define how deep the mist should be. For this scene, we leave the standard values because they are working quite well. Yeah, and basically this is everything we have to set up for our compositing. In my example here, I render this scene in full resolution and also with 100 samples. And I do that because I've already tested my compositing effects. But if you just start out compositing, render your scene with the half resolution and maybe just a few samples to test your compositing effects, because maybe you have to enable more render layers or passes or disable some of them. And then you need to re-render your scene, and after you have tested all your compositing effects, you can increase the quality and see how it looks on your final image. And if you start with a full resolution and a lot of samples, this can take a lot of time if you have to re-render your scene, if you have set up some other render layers or passes. Okay, after you've set up all your render layers and passes and all your render settings, hit render, because we need a rendered image to create the compositing effects. 41 long minutes later, my image is rendered. And now we can start with our compositing. First of all, I split my timeline because I don't need the timeline. And for both editors, I switch to the UV image editor. And up here, I switch to the node editor. You can see here we still have the material nodes enabled. To do the compositing, I click down here on the compositing nodes symbol. And you can see this basically works like the material nodes, so you don't have to learn here something completely new. One important thing, you have to enable use nodes down here in the header of the node editor. That's important that you see the compositing effects in your rendering. Down here in one of the two UV image editors, I enable the render result. That means here we'll see the rendered image. And when I do Ctrl-Shift left click on the render layer, you can see the viewer node will be added. As you maybe can remember, we have used a similar thing with the Node Wrangler add-on for the materials to see different steps inside our node tree, and that's exactly the same thing here. And as you can see here in the left UV image editor, I can choose the viewer node, so I always see what the viewer node is putting out inside the left UV image editor. If I now click Ctrl-Shift left click several times on my render layer, you can see it switching between all the different passes. And also you can see through the viewer node how the passes are looking like inside our UV image editor. And here showing the mist pass, you can see we have the depth information of our scene. Okay, let's start with the compositing settings. With the mouse cursor above the node editor, I press Shift Space, so we have it in full screen. And also I enable backdrop in the header, so we can see what the viewer node puts out inside the background of our node editor. Pressing V, the image gets smaller, and pressing Alt V, the image gets bigger. And pressing Alt and the mouse wheel, you can move the image to another position. Also, when you press N, you find the settings for the backdrop here in the Properties menu. So if you add nodes over the time, Blender has to calculate it, and that can maybe take some time. And if we always have to wait a short while, that doesn't make so much fun. And because of that, I set render and added to low inside the performance panel from the Properties menu. So the quality is a little bit lower, but we can work smoothly. And now, similar to the material nodes, we can add different nodes between our input and output. And for example, here's a RGB curves node to make the image brighter or darker, or adjusting the color. And in this way, we now can edit our image. Okay, at first we start with the mist effect. For that I add with Shift A color ramp and a mix node. The mist output I connect with a color ramp and the color ramp image output with the FAC value of the mix node. With the color ramp we can adjust the strength of the mist effect, and with the mix node we can adjust the color. We want to add the mist effect to our scene, so we have to use the image output from the render layer and place it in the upper entrance of the mix node. You can see with the color ramp you can adjust the depth of the mist effect, and if you adjust the white value you can lower the strength of the mist in your scene in general. And when I click now, Ctrl Shift left click on the mix node, you can see the result in the backdrop. So now both the image and the mist will be mixed, but you can see the mist is quite strong. Using the color down here you can adjust the color of the mist. In my case I use a slightly yellow color for the mist, and also I decrease the strength using the white value of the color ramp, so I get a very weak mist effect. But for example, if you want to create a morning atmosphere, you could increase the mist effect so that you have more mist in your scene. Very important, if you want to have your compositing effects in your final image, you also have to connect the last node with a composite node. If you take a look at the environment output, you see just the background is white and everything else is black. And using this environment path, we will create the sunrays effect. For that I add under filter this sunbeams node and connect the environment output with this node. And if I increase the wavelength value, you can see these sun rays, but they are starting from the middle of the image. And because of that, you basically can adjust the position of the sun using the X and Y value. With the wavelength, you can define the length of the sun rays. So here I want that the sun rays come from the right side and showing to the left side. Okay, now I adjust the sun rays for my scene here. Yeah, now exactly like for the mist, we want to add this sun rays on top of our scene. For that I add another mix node and connect the sunbeams on the lower entrance and the rest on the upper entrance. And now you can see the result is just black. And because of that, I changed the blend type to add. That means the two images will be added. With this setting, we just see the white values and don't see the black values of the image anymore. And so you can see we only see the sun rays. And using the FAC value, we can adjust the strength of the sun rays. Now we have the problem that the sun rays are blue. We want them to be yellow. The blue color comes from the color of the background. You maybe remember we use this HDRI map, and from that the blue color comes from. And to adjust the color I add another mix node in front of the sunbeams node. Then I change the connection of the environment to the FAC value. Then I adjust the upper color to black, and the lower color can be any color you want the sunbeams to be. For example, a slightly yellowish color. So that means with this mix node, basically everything what was black in the image we colored black, and everything what has a brighter color we colored in yellow now. And now if I enable the final result, you can see we now have this nice looking yellow sun rays. So as I have mentioned before, we have now the problem that the sun rays are shining above the tree in the foreground, and that does not really look good. And because of that we has enabled the object index and sets the path index for the trees and some other objects in the foreground to 1. And here in the background you can see the mask created by the object index. And basically we can use this mask to cut out the sun rays above the tree. So and basically all we need to do is to connect the object index with the FAC value of this mix node up here, which is mixing the sun rays with the rest of the image. And doing so, the sun rays will be only viewed on the areas which are white on the image. So now you can see in this case, we just have the sun rays on the tree and we want it exactly in the opposite direction. So we add with Shift A color invert node and place it between the object index and the mix node, and then the colors of the object index will be inverted, so the tree is black and the background is white, and you can see this works well. So and now we have another problem with the sun rays. Basically the sun rays will be created from all the tiny points which are shining through from the background through our trees here. And you can see that also down here. And basically I don't want the sun rays to be so deep in the image, just in the top area of the image. And for that we will also create a mask which will cut out the lower part of the sun rays. And for that I add a box mask node under matte. And this box mask node adds a white box to our image. And with the position and the scale values, I increase the size so that it fits to the whole image, and the position I move it a little bit down. Then I add under filter a blur node, place it behind the box mask, enable the relative checkbox, and with the Y value I now can smooth the box in the vertical direction. And now you can see the smooth edge of the box mask. And this we will mix with our mask from the tree. For that I add a mix node behind the blur node, use the box mask as fag value for the mix node, and then for the first image entrance I use the object index output from the render layers. And as you can see in the background, we now mix the white tree with the white box mask. And now I just have to connect the mix node with the invert node, and then the colors will be inverted again. And now you can see just the area where the sun rays should be is white on the image. If we take a look at the final image, you can see the sun rays at the lower part are now cut off. And moving the box mask up and down, you can adjust where the sun rays should start to show up. And in this case I use 0.2, and you can see on the lower part we don't have any sun rays anymore. Now I collapse all the different nodes we don't need anymore, so we have a little bit better overview here. On the part of the image where we can see the sky, I want to add some glow effects. And for that I add the blur node and connect it with the environment output from the render layers node. Here I also enable relative, so we have a little bit stronger result, and for the percentage values I use 25 by 25. And now you can see the background will be strongly blurred. Now I duplicate the mix node using the add value and connect both the blur node and our compositing with this node, and now you can see the glow effect is added to our scene. You can see the glow effect is blue just like the background, and to adjust that I add a mix node in front of the blur node. And as we did before for the sun rays, we use the environment output for the fag value, and with black and a yellowish color we can colorize the glow effect. Okay, we are nearly done, but you can see the background is still transparent, and for adding a color in the background I add a alpha over node under color, place it behind the last mix node. Then our complete node tree I add to the lower entrance, and above I basically could add another image, or I simply can use a color. And now you can see the white background show through the whole forest. But with this white color the forest looks like if it had very few trees in it. And we want to create a very deep looking forest. And because of that I choose a very dark greenish color, and you can see now the background don't shine through so strongly. And so the forest looks very deep. So to set the focus a little bit better we add a vignette effect. Basically the frame of the image will be darkened a bit. For that I use a ellipse mask. This I adjust in a way that it fits to the whole image. After that I add the blur node and set the X and Y value to 200. And so the mask will be blurred, as you can see. Now I add a mix node behind the blur node, then I add the node tree to the upper value and the blur node to the lower value. Then I set the blend type to multiply, so that we just see the black areas of the vignette. And to adjust the strength of the vignette, you can simply adjust the fag value. Yeah, and basically this is our final compositing setting. Certainly we see that the image is way too dark. To adjust that, we could add RGB curves, for example, and adjust the curve here. But there is another setup here in Blender which makes the coloring and brightness setup much more convenient. And also we can create more beautiful results in seconds. And what I'm talking about you find under Scene Color Management. And to adjust the brightness of the image we can increase the exposure. And also we can adjust the gamma value so the black areas in the image also gets a little bit brighter. So in my case I set the gamma value to 1.5. And under View you can imitate a film look, so click on Film. And only using this setup the whole image looks way more incredible. And also to adjust your image furthermore we find under Look some different color presets. And with this color setup you can define if your image should look warm and friendly or dark and cold. And in our case we want to create a nature scene which is looking very friendly. So basically just test the different looks which looks best for your scene. And to do that very easily just place the mouse cursor above the looks button here, then press Ctrl, scroll the mouse wheel, and in this way you can switch between the different looks. Certainly according to the look you choose you can also adjust exposure and gamma, and also you can enable use curves to have the RGB curve settings. For our image we choose Aqua Color Futura 200 because basically we like this the most. Yeah, and you can see this image looks a little bit mysterious and friendly. And the color management settings you do here won't just be applied to your final rendered image, it will be applied to anything you render in this blend file. That means if you want to have a more beautiful viewport rendering, you can adjust this here. Yeah, that's it with our compositing settings. One important thing, under Render, Post-Processing in the Properties editor, ensure that compositing is enabled. In the basic setting this always is on, but in some cases this maybe could be disabled. And if this is enabled, this compositing effects you just set up will be applied on every frame of your animation. And if you don't want to have your compositing effects, simply disable this option. But keep in mind the color management thing you always have to handle separately. This has nothing to do with the post-processing. Okay, now I could start my render process by clicking on the animation button. But 50 minutes for one image is a little bit too much for my computer and for my time. And because of that, we'll render this scene using a render farm. And how this works, I'll show you in the next video.